And the second person to my right is Nneka Ikelionwu from the Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution in Nigeria. And Nneka is going to be speaking on sins of the father, the danger and futility of transgenerational conflicts in Nigeria.
Hello everyone, my name is Nneka Ikelionwu. I work for the Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution in Nigeria, and I'm here to talk about some of the conflicts that have taken place in Nigeria in recent times. My choice of conflicts, I'm going to discuss the Civil War and 4 inter-tribal conflicts, not ethnic. I chose these conflicts because, well, the Civil War is the most serious conflict we've ever had in Nigeria, and the other 4 are the longest, most protracted conflicts we've had. A lot of the conflicts in Nigeria are, I mean, obviously, like most African countries, after the Cold War, Nigeria went from, obviously, interstate wars to civil wars and communities fighting each other, and then in some cases, the state fighting a particular group, and most of our wars are protracted, they're reoccurrent, and often the next generation does not understand what the original cause of the conflict was. And they just carry on because they're taught to hate a particular tribe, or and so they just carry on the conflict. And and because there are no official accounts of these conflicts, there's no official analysis of the cause, there's no official, and sometimes they're not dealt with decisively. Nigerian youth are often susceptible to manipulations, to propaganda. Politicians use, it's the easiest way for politicians to get support by creating this division between people from different tribes, and so they manipulate the lack of formal information to their advantage. And then, obviously, unless this is dealt with, we'll continue to have the same conflicts over and over and over again. Next slide, please. I'm going to attempt to analyze, well, briefly, some of the conflicts, just try and identify the root causes, and then I'll talk about why it's dangerous for youth to continue to engage in conflicts that they had no hand in the beginning, and then I'll make some recommendations. The first conflict I'm going to talk about is the Nigerian Civil War. Now, the Nigerian Civil War ended many years ago, but in the minds of a lot of Nigerians, it never ended. We still have, I mean, just recently, just in September, there was the army invaded the home of a man called Nnamdi Kanu. He's the head of an organization called IPOB. It's a movement for Biafra, the actualization of Biafra. Now, I don't know how many of you know anything about Nigerian history and the Nigerian Civil War, but one of the reasons for the Civil War was that a section of Nigeria wanted to break away from the country and form their own Republic of Biafra. Now, a convenient root cause of Nigerian Civil War was a coup that happened in January of 1966. Now this coup, I say it's convenient because even the coup itself had its own root causes, and some of them are still related to the cause, the reason for the agitation for Biafra. But I'll say it's a root cause. In 1966, in January, some officials, some military officers carried out a coup to unseat the erstwhile government. The main reason for the coup was to establish a strong, united, and prosperous nation which would be free from corruption and strife. And then the coup plotters further identified the enemies of the country as political profiteers, people that take bribes, and those that seek to keep the country divided permanently, the tribalists and the nepotists. Now, anyone would think, I mean, those are noble objectives. It would have been a positive thing. And so they carried out the coup. It was relatively well, it wasn't a success in the sense that they were able to unseat the government, but they planned the coup to take place in the 3 regions of the country, but it didn't work out in some of the regions. And eventually, barely 6 months after, the coup had been tagged an Igbo coup. Igbo is a tribe in Nigeria, and most of the officers that planned the coup were Igbo. And it was termed, it was referred to, they started referring to it as the Igbo coup, and the Northerners they basically took a head count of the casualties and found out that there were no Igbo casualties, or very few Igbo casualties, as opposed to Northerners, and there were lots of Northern casualties. So everyone forgot about all the other getting rid of corruption, nepotism, and all the other noble causes for the coup, reason for the coup, and concentrated on the fact that many people from a particular tribe were killed and others were spared, or so it appeared. Incidentally, it's been said that it was the British that first of all suggested that there might be a tribal motive for the coup. In the British press, they're talking about how it was an agenda to get rid of the northern elite, and all of a sudden it caught on, and it finally led to riots all over the country, killing of Igbo people in other parts of Nigeria, and then eventually there was a counter coup in July of the same year, and then people they continued killing the Easterners, and then eventually, we don't know that. And the aim and the next. Okay, yes. And then there was pogrom in the north and some other parts of Nigeria where Easterners were killed and the government couldn't do anything about it. In fact, the government then at some point admitted that they were not able to curtail the massacre of Easterners in the north. And then they at some point, they also placed an economic embargo on the east. And so this further aroused feelings of oppression in eastern Nigeria, and it gave rise to agitations for secession, and it was led by the government of eastern Nigeria, and Ojukwu, General Ojukwu. And on the 4th and 5th of January 1967, the military leaders of Nigeria met at Aburi in Ghana. The plan was to try and come up with a solution and a way forward. Now, there are conflicting accounts of what happened at Aburi, but some of the agreed on accounts would say that Ojukwu, that's the head of Eastern Nigeria, went in with a plan. He knew exactly what he was going in for, and then the government of Nigeria didn't go in with a plan. They talk about it like it's a negative thing that he had a plan when he went in, but they agreed on some things, and the Nigerian government did not follow through on their obligations under Aburi Accord, and as a result, in May of 1967, Biafra announced that it was going to secede from Nigeria, and in July of the same year, the Nigerian government declared war on Biafra, and that was how the Civil War started. Now, during the war, Biafra managed to alienate itself from the rest of Nigeria. It even attacked the Midwest, which was not really, it didn't really have a problem with at the time. And then one very important factor in the Civil War was propaganda, the use of propaganda by both parties. It's so bad that till date, we don't even have the exact figures. Figures range from 500,000 to 2 million people that died. It's that bad, from 500,000 to 2 million people. And accounts of different atrocities that were committed by, especially the federal government against the Easterners, but we're not sure to what extent these are true. But what is clear is that by the end of the war in 1970, seemingly irreversible damage had been done to the relationship between the Easterners and the rest of Nigeria, even though they were forced to be reintegrated into Nigeria. Now I'm going to move on to the next conflict because the conclusion is basically the same for the rest. The next conflict is the Umulere conflict. Now what's funny about these four conflicts that I've chosen is they are not these are people from the same community, the neighboring villages. In this particular case, their bone of contention is a little strip of land that lies between the two communities, which is surrounded by rivers. And so for that reason, it attracted a lot of colonial business. And so each of these communities were laying claim to this particular piece of land because of the economic viability and the fact that they could make a lot of money by selling land. And each community's claim was based on the heritage of Eri. It's a divine god that came down from the sky. That's the myth. Came down from the sky and created the state in which these two communities exist. And one of them says, one version is that these particular people are the direct descendants of the god, and the other says that the other party says that they're not direct descendants, they're the children of a concubine. And so basically the root of their claim to that piece of land, or torture is what it's called, is based on their lineage from Eri. And then the fact that the British came in didn't make matters easy, because first of all, they sought to control land in the community, and so they started causing a shift from communal land ownership to individual land ownership, because then it was easier for them to buy land from individuals without necessarily having to respect the communal and cultural land ownership tenure. And so Aguleri accepted Christianity before Umuleri, and because of that, they were given positions in the colonial government, and they used their positions in the colonial government to further oppress Umuleri. And at a point in 1910, an Aguleri man was appointed the warrant chief, and at that time, warrant chief was a very powerful man. He was his area of jurisdiction included both Aguleri, Umuleri, as well as Otwocha, the disputed strip of land. And even when in the 20s, the colonial authorities tried to revert back to quasi-communal ownership of land. I say quasi because as opposed to land being owned by communities, they were reverting to a system where it was the warrant chiefs that owned that basically had power to deal with land. And so that made the Aguleri man very powerful, and he carried on, he carried out a lot of land transactions that the Umuleri people were not happy about, and they finally took legal action against him in 1933, and several legal actions. One thing about all the legal actions that were taken was the court would say the land doesn't belong to this tribe, but would never say it belonged to the other tribe. So the matter was never dealt with definitively. And then eventually, the crown abandoned all rights to the land, and then the problem was that with abandonment, the right to the land was supposed to revert back to someone, and so the conflict started again, because then the two communities were at war as to who the land rights would revert. And then of course, because the Aguleri people embraced Christianity first, they were more educated, so they were able to effectively muscle the Muleri people out of politics and everything else. And then the conflict manifested several times in different ways over the years, and it usually took just a little thing to trigger off, just because of the deep-seated bitterness between the communities. Now the next conflict, Ife Modakeke, is similar in the sense that they're neighboring. In fact, the Modakeke people were migrants. They had been displaced from their original homes, and then the then head of Oni of Ife had created Modakeke to accommodate them. But after a while, it seemed to the indigenous Ife people that Modakeke people were becoming politically aware, and were going to be able to push them out or compete with them politically. So they started trying to suppress that, and then the Modakeke people kicked against it for a while. Now the third conflict, the Ugorji, is slightly different in the sense that, the Ugors are they're an unfortunate tribe, if you like. They're one of the largest tribes in Nigeria, but because they're spread across 6 states, they're always minorities in every state that they're found. And so the Chakiri, again, just like Utocha, the geographical location of their land gave them this advantage economically, and then the colonial, the British came and they preferred their land for trading, and the Ijos were not happy about it, but they were able to, again, oppress the Ijos for many years, and they tried to push for a creation of their own local government area, but that never came to pass. And then another conflict, the Tiv-Jukun conflict. In this case, it's a bunch of tribes that live within north-central Nigeria. And the main reason for their conflict is the fact that the Tiv are farmers, and they farm yams, which basically destroy the land, in which once you harvest the land, you have to leave it for some years before you can use it again. And so they moved around often to other lands, and the Jukun were not pleased about that, and so it was the main problem. It caused a lot of conflict between them. Now I'm going to move on to the real topic at hand. One identifying factor of all this conflict is that most of them have roots in pre-colonial times. They are rooted in tussles over power, land, relevance, indigent settler status. And while a lot of those issues don't exist in present-day Nigeria, these conflicts still do. I mean, it's just they're not very serious, some of them when they occur now, but it just takes a Juku man sneezing funny around the Tiv man, and there's a major violent tussle, a major violent incident. And the reason for this is, well, I think, is first of all because the history of these conflicts is not taught in schools anymore. It's always easy for someone to come in and tell whatever version they need to tell to get whatever results they need to get, and so as a result, the youth are always. It's easy to get, and especially because we have issues of poverty, unemployment, and all that in Nigeria, it's easy to manipulate the youth to pick up arms and fight. In 2009, a man called Asimola conducted a survey. He based it on the Ife Modakeke people, 2009. As at 2009, they had lived in relative peace for many years. But the results of that survey were very enlightening in the sense that, as to illustrate the fact that people don't let go of old grievances. Now, of the people that he questioned, right, only 90% have witnessed at least one episode of the crisis personally, and most of them have witnessed later episodes, not the core, obviously the core conflict started in the 20s, so most of them had not witnessed it personally. But more than 79 had heard about them after they had become adults. Yet, intermarriage between them as at now was still frowned upon. And they basically still harbored sentiments of bitterness and hatred towards the people. And so, okay, in conclusion, it's necessary for counter narratives to be propagated widely for a change of mindset to occur, and so that people can start healing and we can move on. So that's basically it. And for the record, I've bought completely into the theory of humanization, and I think it's a good place for us to start with this process of healing the wounds and letting the youth move on more peacefully.